So I don't know if there's any questions. I see there's a lot in the chat, so let me, sorry. If there are any questions, feel free to raise your hand. Sorry. Okay. Are there any questions?
Would you like me to read some of the ones out loud?
Yeah, please.
In the chat. Okay.
Yeah.
Cool. So one of the questions we had early on was, what is the highest reliability percentage you've gotten to in identifying data, the recognition of apples/pears?
Well, I think it depends on what it is that you're looking to identify. I realize that's kind of like a hedging answer. So for example, when we were looking at how to deploy artificial intelligence or machine learning in sensitivity review, one of the things the machines did really well, the machines that we were looking at, off-the-shelf commercial machines, was identifying personal data. So things like names, because that's natural language processing, that's entity extraction, places, addresses, national security numbers, visa numbers, all these types of things. These are easily identified by machines. And we normally got, I think we ended up having in the 80 percentile range. In the literature, they were getting up to 90%. So those are areas where the machine has a greater level, a greater capability to have higher accuracy levels. I think that, again, there's a risk. There were risks that, 20% meant that there's 20% of the information that was not identified. And so it was a matter, and this was a sort of, I think we were on our, I don't know, our second or third pass with the machine. And so you have to remember that this process is iterative. It's, you have to keep going at it and going at it and going at it at multiple tries to get to these levels of sort of accuracy, precision, recall, F1 scores. It's not going to happen on your first pass. So that's, it's just to be mindful of that. So we were getting about 80%. The literature was, some of the literature around this, they were getting 90%. It just depends. When we looked at context specific sort of a sensitivity, so things like national security, international relations, information provided in confidence, we were getting really poor results, like 30–40% return. And these were with systems that said that they could do sentiment analysis, that could do word co-location, but the sensitivities vary. The sensitivities varied according to the classes of records that you were dealing with. Information provided in confidence, you're not going to find, it's going to be different every time you deal with information provided in confidence. It's not going to have it's not going to have one person who that's going to show up all of the time, or it's not going to have one topic that's going to show up all the time, or it's, so for these types of things, it's no good. And that's where when I talk about the limitations of these technologies in terms of what they can do and what they can do well and how complex the assessment is that they can do. This is where the question becomes important. The base training data set becomes important. But I think too, ensuring that you have realistic expectations about what the outcomes are, that this is not a silver bullet. It's not going to solve all your problems. But it's something to be mindful of. At least we had a sense of what some of the algorithms were that we were working with. So we were working with latent semantic indexing, Dirichlet latent allocations algorithm. And these are all text mining algorithms, and they were just trained on different data sets. So the latent semantic indexing data set that we were working with was trained primarily on newspaper articles. So it's not an ideal training data set if you're looking at trying to identify sensitivity in a class of records, right? But it could be good in terms of name extraction or entity extraction and these types of things. Is there any other questions?
We had another question about 30 minutes in that asked whether you thought topic modeling could be useful as part of the appraisal exercise carried out by the archivist in the larger context of an acquisition.
Well, I think you can do topic modeling, but I think the question becomes how consistent are the topics that you're modeling given the the variability and the different types of records that you may be dealing with and where they're coming from. So I think if there's a level of a consistency in the records that you may be dealing with and the types of topics that you're identifying over time, then yeah, I think topic modeling can be useful. If you're looking at, specific functions, that might be useful, but the thing is that functions and topics change over time. So the question becomes, how quickly do you need to retrain or rebuild the topics that might sit behind the machine learning algorithm to ensure you're getting everything that you need to get when you're doing appraisal and selection or sensitivity review. And that requires as well to have a level of understanding of the types of records and the types of topics that you're expecting to see as the information is plugged in. And when we were working with our government departments, it wasn't always the case. They didn't always know what the relevant they didn't always know what the date was, because the date had been modified or changed at different points of migration. So it made it difficult then to understand how to build our topic models or our sort of thesauri to sit behind the algorithm, or to sit behind in the machine to train it so that it could extract and find all the information that we needed. It's a possibility. It's just a question of like, at what point do you refresh that topic model?
Okay, great. So this is the question about transparency. And they're asking whether the US has a law or policy where the government has to be able to explain in depth the deployment of AI. So it sounds like there's similar things happening in the EU and the Netherlands.
Yes. So I am aware that this is happening in the EU. I am not aware at this point, and I defer to Rebecca on this because she lives in the US. I'm not aware at this point of any laws that require a level of transparency around the deployment of AI and explainability and all these types of things.
We had another question, which is, do you have any links or sources for successful use of AI or good software in archiving/DM lifecycle?
I would say I would have examples to look at. So I think, looking at the Israeli National Archives of Israel example, that would be one. I think there's some interesting work being done at National Archives UK. So an interesting thing they did, although this is not necessarily, it's a type of machine learning, I guess you could call it that. It's they applied Bayesian statistical probability to assess their digital preservation risk. So they worked closely with some mathematicians. I believe it's at the University of Southampton. The project is called, hold on, I'll put at least the project name. It's called Diagram. And I think it's not letting me, Diagram. Let's see if it lets me do that. So that's the name of the project. And they have actually used that to good effect. What they've done with the probabilistic model that's come out of it around preservation risk is that they've been able to take that to government decision makers and argue for more funding. So that's an example. I think that's an example of a type of machine learning, if you will, or a type of mathematical model that has assisted archives in a different way to measure risk from a digital perspective. But this is more probability. It's not any type of text mining or machine learning. It's about looking at digital preservation risks and using the Bayesian model to assess the probability of an outcome regarding a particular risk. So I would say go to the National Archives UK blog because they talk a bit more about it. But I do know that they've been able to argue for funding because decision makers understand that. They understand risk and they understand what that means. And especially if you can apply a mathematical model to it and probability to it, it lends it more weight.
So we had another question, which asks you to give, from an archival perspective and records management perspective, an idea of the differences between archival data, metadata, and algorithms.
So Archival data is, well, metadata is information about a record. So if you go and look at your, your Word document and you click properties, that's metadata. That's information about the document. And that exists whether you're dealing with text records, whether you're dealing with photographs, digital photographs. That's information that sits in the background. That sits in the background of digital information. So that's metadata. Archival information is, it depends on the institution. It depends on the acquisition mandate. Normally, a formal definition is something that is made, received, and set aside by a physical, so an individual, or juridical, so an organization, a physical or juridical person during the usual course of business. And what it does is that it documents important decisions, important events, important activities. In this case, looking at it from a government perspective, it would be anything, any important government decisions, any policy decisions, any important projects, events, any, how does the government carry out its functions? So those would constitute the archival record. And then an algorithm is a piece of computer software it can be expressed in many different ways, but it's trained to identify information, whether that's, structured information, which is data sets, or unstructured information, which is Word documents, PowerPoint presentations, photographs. And and as I said earlier, it depends on the question that the algorithm has been developed to address, in terms of then how it processes the data that it receives. If we're talking about this from an appraisal and selection point of view, and how we deploy machine learning technologies to do appraisal and selection, again, that is entirely dependent on the government. It is dependent on, the types of records, where they've come from, which department have they come from, what are the dates that you're dealing with? Because again, if you're looking at this from a metadata perspective, so if you're looking at this from what sits behind, the record, sometimes some of that metadata may inadvertently be corrupted because it was transferred from one system to another, and the date of that record is no longer useful because it's inherited the date that it was migrated. So we had this issue with one of our departments where we were looking for information from 1995. Because they were due to transfer that information, we couldn't find any. We were using the e-discovery software, text analytics software, to find the 1995 material. We couldn't find it. What we were seeing was that there was a peak in 2000, and we couldn't figure out why. And then we asked them, and they're like, "Oh, well, we actually migrated to an information management system at that point, and those records must have inherited that date." So, even if you're doing this from an appraisal and selection point of view, and you're trying to tell the algorithm, I need you to find this date, or I need you to find this concept, or I need you to find this, if the metadata is corrupted, it's not going to be able to find it. And if you're trying to identify a specific concept or event, but something's misspelled, it's not going to find it. So, I think when we look at the sort of the different parts of it, and from an appraisal and selection point of view, the algorithm is there to process the data at scale and quickly, but it's limited by the metadata and how useful and accurate the metadata is, and by the content of the record and what exactly it is that an archivist or a policy, an acquisition mandate has determined might be the records and scope to be identified and captured as part of that process. I don't know if that answers your question.
We'll see if there are any follow-ups. But in the meantime, we have a good question, which might be hard to answer in just one sitting, which is, how do archivists have to deal with ethics in AI?
So, right. I think there's sort of many ways to cut this. I think that there's sort of two perspectives from my point of view. So as archivists, and again, I'm speaking primarily from as someone who's worked in the public sector. As archivists, by having a handle on how machine learning software works and how this can impact policy decisions, it's that sometimes we end up being the ethics body. We end up being the ones saying, have you considered, or you may want to consider doing this. So I did that when I worked in the civil service, where I had government departments that were using machine learning software to do policy decisions or make policy decisions, but the actual documentation process, so how they got from point A to point B, so the training point being point A to point B, which is the policy decision or the advice that they were giving based on how they trained the machine learning model and the outcome of that model, wasn't being documented. And as an archivist, I had to go back to them, one, because I had to say, well, from an archival perspective, I need this because I need to understand what you're doing because you're potentially affecting people's lives. But also I had to go back to them and say, look at, like, you, again, potentially affecting people's lives. And if you get pulled up before the, the public select committee to account for how this decision was made, how are you going to explain that to them? How are you going to tell them how you've arrived to point B and what you did from point A to point B and how you've ensured the integrity of that process? And that is where the archivist plays a role from an ethical point of view to say, have you thought about this? Have you made sure that you documented this from an accountability and transparency perspective? I think where another area that we can potentially play a role is once we understand the types of training data that might be used, it's a question of, well, considering the question that you're asking, what is this a complete enough set of training data to arrive at a decision that has integrity to it, especially when you're, especially if it's affecting people's lives. So have you accounted for, so people who may be from depressed or deprived socioeconomic backgrounds? Have you considered, underrepresented groups? Have you considered, women? Have you, depending on what the question is that they're trying to address? I think a perfect example would be what happens, for example, in the UK with the equivalent of their SATs. So they last in 2020, they couldn't have everybody sit the exams. So they applied an algorithm to come up with a potential outcome of the final grades. It created a catastrophe because what was eventually found out was that the algorithm more often than not was downgrading students from lower socioeconomic backgrounds or from deprived parts of the country. And it was upping the grades sometimes for students that were from higher socioeconomic backgrounds. So there were huge issues. But this is where, as an archivist, we might have been able to ask the question. And there had been questions asked by others. I think when we look at this from the perspective of how do we ensure appraisal and selection, I think that that's a reflection the profession has to have. I think that there are really there's a couple things we need to consider when we talk about bias and ethics when we deploy these technologies. One is that there is a level of bias in the record that we need to accept. The records represent how a given institution or organization was operating at a specific point in time. And it's important to preserve that because if there are allegations around discrimination or around unfair treatment, the issue is that if we're compensating for that bias, if we're saying, well, we need to make sure that this is a more representative overview of what was going on, we're actually covering over some important pieces of information. So I think when we look at this from a machine learning model perspective, it's how much of that historical bias should we accept? I think we should accept it as it is, ensure that it's as complete as possible as a historical record. And if we're seeing bias, I think that there are other ways to create a more holistic picture by either through descriptive methods. We're working into a more interconnected descriptive methodology with the application of records and context. And so it's how do we make those external linkages with the permission of the communities that may not be present or represented in the records, so that you have a better understanding of the sort of atmosphere or how things are working at that time. But I think that these are real ethical questions that we need to look much more in depth at. And I would say it's better to start thinking about this now. I think that there are already great examples around algorithmic accountability that can help guide us as we look at these types of questions, can also help guide us around as we look at the impact of AI in policy decision making. There's the Montreal Declaration, there's the American Computer, I believe, American Computer Association, one of the first to write about algorithmic accountability. So I think that, there's already a lot of great examples out there around ethics and AI, and also then how we can deploy that in our own practice.
Wonderful, thank you. It looks like we have one other question in the chat. So someone is asking how we can know optimum results for the best machine learning multiple algorithms in an implementation phase. What should we consider in priority in the context of an archival science while we're making machine learning processes? And then finally, will the classical archival theory steps become history in this sense?
So I don't know if I fully understand the question, but I might tackle the second half of that question. I think that there are concepts that remain vitally important in whether you're using machine learning. Well, particularly when you're using machine learning. Context and provenance. I think that original order, I think when we're dealing with digital, I think that's out the window. I don't know that exists anymore. But I would say that context and provenance are important. Provenance, for those of you that don't know, it's about where the records come from. So what department or what institution or what person they come from. And it becomes important, especially if we're using machine learning algorithms to find relevant information that we would like to acquire, or even that you may want to make available through the process of access. And context becomes important because it's about, when we look at bias, I think that's important. What's the context of operations of that organization? How were they running at that time? What were the major events that were happening that, from an appraisal and selection point of view, we may want to acquire? What are the types of biases that we may need to accept as we work through this? I think that, if we look at perhaps, offensive language, because there are times when institutions have been, are racist, or, there have been inappropriate situations which need to be documented. But I think then, there are already really great examples about how to describe that in a, I wouldn't say non-controversial, but in a more balanced and judicious way. So, I think some of the concepts, some of the principles definitely there. I think that how we have done appraisal and selection in the past for paper, I don't think it's going to float moving forward. I think there are some things that we might be able to transfer into a machine learning environment. So picking up on a point earlier around topic analysis, functional analysis, that might be helpful. But I think to me, it's a different world that, and we need to adapt to that different world. I don't necessarily believe that the concepts that we applied in the paper analog environment are transferable to a digital environment even just from a sensitivity review point of view. I can tell you that a lot of the classic things that were done in sensitivity review. So one way that sensitivity reviewers would identify how sensitive or how sensitive a file was by how well used the file itself was. If it had been flipped through a lot of times, that indicated significance. How thick the file was. You can't get that sense when you're working in a digital environment. You can't get that sense at all. Sometimes annotations on the file, sometimes if it was in a different file folder, like a different color, that sometimes indicated sensitivity. You don't have any of those cues in a digital environment. And so I think a lot of the ways that we may have done sensitivity review moving forward, that's not going to fly. I would say that trying to do macro appraisal, considering how chaotic the digital environment is, I think that trying to apply macro appraisal approaches, I personally wouldn't recommend it unless you have a level of certainty and understanding about the organization and how they operated. But based on my experiences working in the civil service, it's that, you have information management systems that coexist alongside file shares. You find a lot of the times that the file shares have more data than the information management systems, because information management systems end up being too complex to use for users to wrap their brains around. So, I think there are different things that we need to think about as we engage with this and as we try and deploy these technologies. And current archival theory, at least for as applied to analog, I don't think is or maybe not theory, let's just say current practices are not applicable. I think some of the theoretical components might be useful, but I think that they need to be reconsidered in light of the digital operating environment.
Thea, I think you've tackled all the questions in the chat, which is amazing. We have just 4 minutes if people have any other questions, but otherwise it looks like you're getting a lot of thank yous
Okay.
for your wonderful presentation.
Thank you very much. I hope it was useful.
I put a link to the HERA website, which is where the recording will be made available afterwards. And if people are interested in participating in HERA, I guess they can find out through the website or get in touch with you or Rebecca.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think I'm happy to make the slides available. I've tried to reference as much as I possibly can, so there's no copyright violations.
That's wonderful. Thank you again so much. And we'll see you in 2 weeks.
Yep. So the next session will be much more interactive and more group work. So I don't know if that is of interest to people. Sometimes not so much. Archivists tend to be, not to tout stereotypes, but we do tend to be a bit introverted. So, well, thank you very much, everyone. I really appreciate you taking the time to come. And I hope you all have a wonderful day, evening, night, wherever you are. And hopefully I'll see some of you on the 30th of November.
All right. Thank you again, Anthea, for a wonderful session, and Rebecca for organizing. I will save the questions from today. Okay. And I will also, once the recording is ready, I'll share it with both of you so that you can have a look before it goes up on the website.
That sounds good. And I just need to I think most of the slides are fine.